Today's lecture is titled At Home in Foreign Lands, Syed Mujtaba Ali's depiction of Afghanistan, 1927 to 1929. Afghanistan, a focal point of British military ambition in the 19th and 20th centuries, had also ironically turned out to be the most spectacular failure of the British expansionist policy. In the milieu of imperial narratives circulating across the globe, we find a distinct voice of a young Bengali traveler in the northwestern terrain, weaving through his travelogue a counter-argument and a glimpse of the land beyond a colonial viewpoint. Filled with geographical descriptions, anecdotes, and personal experiences along the way, Syed Mujtaba Ali's Deshe not only remains a classic example of Bengali travel literature, it provides us a view of Afghanistan at a pivotal juncture, a transition point between imperial experiments and decolonization. Now I'd like to invite our secretary, Bhushan Chakraborty, to introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Mou Banerjee of University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Thank you, everyone. Dr. Mou Banerjee is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her academic focus includes the interplay between religion and politics in India, with a particular interest in the evolution of private faith and political identity within the public sphere. Dr. Banerjee's forthcoming book, The Disinherited Christianity and Conversion in Colonial India, will be published by Harvard University Press in January 2025. Dr. Banerjee's work critically examines the role of Protestant Christian conversion as a focal point for public debate, social reform, and anti-colonial resistance in colonial India during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Dr. Banerjee earned her PhD from Harvard University in 2018. Her research has been published in a number of academic journals and in the Anandabazar Potrika and Daily Star of Bangladesh. I would now present the stage.
I would like to thank all of you for being here in spite of the torrential rain. It makes my heart glad to see you, and I hope I don't bore you to death while I'm talking. If I do, please just throw pieces of paper, which is a time-honored way of shutting a speaker up, I think. Thanks to Himagno and all of you for inviting me. This is a great pleasure for me, and even more than that, it's a great pleasure for my mother, who was like, Presidency, tomake dekeche. You know, they've invited you. She is very, very skeptical of any of my abilities, so thank you for making her realize that I'm onto something. I'm going to talk today about Syed Mujtaba Ali, someone who is both very, very well loved among Bengali scholars, writers, and also someone who I think has not received his due, perhaps because he was the originator of the Bengali form of bell letters or Romorochana, which essentially is writing in a lighter vein about travels, about human experiences, and as such, therefore, hasn't merited consideration as one of the great intellectuals of the Bengali literary tradition. I think this is a misstep on the part of critics, and I'll try and sort of think about why that is so while I share my ideas with you. Please ask me questions. I am terrified of difficult questions, but I promise I'll try to answer them as fairly as I can. Yeah? Thank you very much. So I think we can start now. At Home in Foreign Lands is a direct translation of his novel Deshe, Bideshe. Deshe meaning at home, Bideshe meaning in foreign lands, but the very funny thing about Syed Mujtaba Ali was that both in his writing and in his own life, what was a foreign land and what was his own country, his homeland, always gets sort of mixed up. Sometimes the foreign land is far more of a home than his own land would ever be. And I think his sojourn to Afghanistan, to Kabul, when he was barely 23 years old, like many of you here, he just finished his MA exams, he was invited by the education department there, and that I think set the trend for a lifetime of discovery of other people and homes among foreign lands. So we'll just start there. I'm very bad with technology, so you'll have to bear with me. There are a few things I want to sort of touch upon while I'm talking today. Deshe Bideshe is known as a travelogue. So I want to sort of think about how travel can be autobiography and how a travelogue can be a piece of historical documentation, which itself can be a piece of history, right? Anyone who writes a travelogue Bideshe was written in between 1946 and 48. Mujtaba was in Afghanistan between 1927 and 29. So there is a lag of almost 20 years between the time period he was in Kabul and when he wrote his document, Deshe. So what is history? What do we think of memory and its place in historical documentation? And how do we reconstruct the past? Deshe is very much a document, a map of reconstruction, both of the self and of a journey, as much as it is a historical documentation of a pivotal moment in Kabul and in Afghanistan. I want to talk about the flaneur. All of you know what it is to give adda, right? Presidency is famous for it. I have been told I need to partake in it as well. A flaneur is someone who's interested in adda. A flaneur is someone who aimlessly walks into spaces, into large cities. All of you know about it from Walter Benjamin. What Mujtaba does, I think, is marry these two ideas, the adda-baj, the rock-baj, and the flaneur. And you find that in almost every single thing he writes after Deshe. But it's very much evident in Deshe as well. So how does a flaneur, a historian, the person who has no other work but to wander a city, Bengali parents would be like, what are you doing with your life? But obviously there is some value to that as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And if I don't and forget, please ask me a question. And finally, we are going to be talking about the limits of colonial control and mobility through travel, right? And here I kind of want to talk about something I've been calling strange intimacies. You go somewhere, you meet someone, you learn a new language, you place yourself in a new culture. The intimacy that is then formed perhaps is not the intimacies we think about. It's not romantic, but perhaps friendship is as much of an intimacy as anything else. And what happens in Deshe and what we find in Mujtaba's book over and over again, I think is an exploration of this stranger, queerer, off-the-way intimacies, which perhaps are more important to him than the more normal intimacies, the heteronormative intimacies that we can think about. So first and foremost, India and Afghanistan. What do we make of it? And I'm very fond of maps because when I teach in the US, most of my students don't even know where India is. You have to begin with the map. This is Afghanistan. All of you know what it looks like. All of you also know that Bengalis have a special affinity for Afghans. Most of you read Kabuliwala at some point in your life, I hope, or have watched the film if you haven't done that, right? There is a particular kind of, understanding that we need to have, which is that Kabul is less than 1,000 kilometers from Delhi. That is not a very wide span of space. But somehow post-colonial borders have essentially made it feel like this is a very far-off land. During the British period, up to 1947, Afghanistan, you could reach up to Peshawar from train from Howrah, and then you could take a journey on a bus or a camel, whatever was your preferred route. And it would take about 2 or 3 days, which is almost a journey that would take you to the southern part of India as well, right? So this is not a very far off land, at least for Mujtaba. Yeah. 2 other things to think of in the introduction, as your friend said. Afghanistan is a space where the imagination, the colonial imagination and the Indian imagination runs rampant. There are 3 Anglo-Afghan wars. The British face very poor outcomes in at least the first 2. In the third, there is a treaty called the Treaty of Kandahar that is signed, which essentially means that the Amir of Afghanistan agrees that Afghanistan would not have any diplomatic outreach other than through the window of India. That is the language that is used. In 1892-93, the Durand line is drawn, as you can see here, right? And the agreement to draw the Durand line is one single page agreement. This is perhaps the first senseless partition in the South Asian subcontinent. Many of you might know about the Taliban. They all come from around that because that is a Pashtun homeland. So in some ways that has been called, at least in US diplomacy, the most dangerous border zone in the entire world. the way in which Mujtaba talks about this border zone, especially about Peshawar, for example, is very, very different from the general speak that you would find in diplomatic and military history about this particular line. By 1919, the very young Emir of Afghanistan, Amanullah Khan, essentially has taken over the throne. His mother apparently is a Mughal princess and orchestrates the murder of both her husband and her husband's brother. Also manages to dethrone the older brother. Amanullah Khan is an older brother, by embroiling him in some kind of controversy. So Amanullah Khan is both very, very seasoned. If this does not happen, there is no lecture, right? So this is very good omens. I think you have to just stand here with me and make it happen, yeah? At least you saw them now. Now you know where the different lines are. কি হবে? ধারে পাশে থাকুন।
I will go get my stuff.
Now I'm going to be very careful about not stepping on lines, but we'll see. So essentially, Amanullah Khan, even though he's very young, is a very well-seasoned politician. He also has modernist ideas. He's a reformer, comes in the third Anglo-Afghan war, essentially wrests back that diplomatic control from the British. Remember, India would essentially control the diplomatic affairs of Afghanistan. Amanullah makes sure that that provision is taken away. He gets married to one of the greatest reformers, the daughters of one of the greatest reformers of Afghanistan, Mou Banerjee. His older brother also gets married to one of Mou Banerjee's daughters, and essentially starts bringing in a whole new slew of reforms into Afghanistan, which is lauded by the Western countries, including Britain, but which would also bring about his own downfall and set a pattern of the ways in which political reform in Afghanistan essentially has always received a huge, severe setback at any moment when it has been rushed through and any moment when it has been on Western models. Right? So again, what is Afghanistan? Why should we even bother about it? It's a war-torn land, it's a never-never land, it's a dangerous place, it's the middle of nowhere. The Taliban up there, every single other day the Anandavaja Potrika will write in its strange spelling something about Talibani things happening without making any sense whatsoever, but that's my own prejudices about it. What does Afghanistan mean to Indians, right? It is a gateway to India since Alexander the Great. It is where the Mughals first stepped foot. It is where the first Mughal emperor is buried in Kabul. It is where the idea of Hindustan itself starts originating. I don't think you can talk about India, I don't think you can talk about Hindustan without thinking about Afghanistan. And in such a matter, I'm talking about this because area studies is very big in the US, all of you know about it. So there is South Asia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, perhaps Sri Lanka. And then there is Southeast Asia, and somehow Burma is a part of that. And then there is the Middle East, and somehow Afghanistan is a part of that. But if you look at the longer Turing history, if you don't merely look at what has been happening in the 20th century, Afghanistan and Burma, oh my God, Afghanistan and Burma are very much still a part of what is the subcontinent in its long Turing.
Pull the mic up a bit so that it doesn't interfere with the. Yes, that's it.
So essentially, if you look at any diplomatic, paper from the last 20 years or so, especially, even after 21, when the war on terror came to an end, and then go back to the 1920s and then go back to 1839 and just compare those side by side. See what is being said about Afghanistan, about the Afghan people, about the tribes, about the borders. you will find that that language hasn't shifted much. But Indians, as I said, obviously have a far greater historical connection, a far more close linguistic, cultural sort of space sharing than you should give Afghanistan credit for, right? So we need to keep that in mind when we think about why someone like Syed Mujtaba, who was born in Sylhet on the other side near the Burma border, right, would find going to Kabul such an important part of his life. Why he would find so much happiness there, and then so much grief when the civil war essentially upends his life there within a space of 2 years or so. If I give a lecture in Kolkata, I feel like I have to talk about this particular man, very handsome, younger Rabindranath Tagore, right? I think one of the things that made Mujtaba Ali even consider going to Afghanistan was the fact that he spent 5 years of his life at Shantiniketan, that he had very close connections with Tagore. He was the first Muslim boy to actually receive a BA degree from Shantiniketan as well. And this is where he has many connections with the wide array of international scholars who all come to Shantiniketan to teach at Rabindranath's invitation. The very fact that Tagore has written a story called Kabuliwala, which I've shown you an excerpt from, though all of you say you've already read it, essentially makes him think that this is a possible venture that he might undertake. He's also essentially aided in this journey across to a foreign land by the fact that many of his professors at Shantiniketan by this point had undertaken either educational approaches in Afghanistan at the invitation of Amanullah Khan, or they were involved in the archaeological work that was beginning in some of the most important sites in South Asia, including at Burgam, right, and at Bamyan. And third, also because, Shantiniketan's decrees were not accepted by the British government as valid. So to have a job in India with a BA degree from Shantiniketan would have been almost impossible. It would give him a job in Afghanistan because Rabindranath Tagore apparently had a huge following there. If you remember, the first person who gets him at the Peshawar railway station actually recites one of Tagore's poems in Pashto to him, O Maharaja Dulal, his Ay Mother. It starts from there. So essentially, this is one place where Tagore's Vishwabharati, University of the World, would have the kind of validation that was lacking within India itself. Yeah? I want you to sort of take a look at this is a translation by William Radichet of Kabuliwala. I just want you to take a look at this and perhaps tell me what you think about this in a sentence or so. What is happening here? What is Tagore doing? Something very interesting happening. What do you think he's doing here? He's listening to an Afghan man talk about Afghanistan and Kane Kala jo hai.
He's essentially making us paint a picture in our minds.
Yes. He's essentially dissolving that divide between the home and the foreign land. He can sit at home in his living room on a morning, Sunday morning, listen to someone talk about Afghanistan, and it becomes something that is clear in his mind. It's something that is familiar to him, right? It becomes familiar through the process of storytelling. This collapsing of imaginary boundaries, this way of looking at something that is very far away through the imagination brought home, is something, a technique that Mujtaba Ali will use over and over again, not merely in Deshe Bideshe, but in Chole Rangai, but in Chacha Kahini, in almost all of his travels. Yeah? This is perhaps not what historians do, but I'll also remind you that Saidiya Hartman and others have called this particular way of looking at history critical fabulation, the way in which to essentially fill in the gaps where your story is fragmented. And you do that thoughtfully, you do that with your evidence, but what Mujtaba Ali is essentially doing, and he's also doing something very interesting. Anyone who partakes in critical fabulation is someone who is wayward, not quite a proper historian, you see. But he uses that waywardness essentially to feed into a very, very intensely felt understanding of whatever is foreign and make it home. So is Mujtaba the only person who talks about Afghanistan? No, as I told you, Bengalis love Afghanistan, Afghanistan in general. And as you can see, there is a wide range of people who wrote about Afghanistan, wrote about Peshawar, and up to the present day, at least 2010 is very much in the present day, right? And in each and every one of these travelogues, if you were to read them, if you were to look at them, you would find that particular kind of intimacy, historical, cultural, linguistic, somehow bear upon the writers. They're surprised by it, by how familiar everything seems. But that is because, again, we have all known about Afghanistan and in some way essentially interiorized our own ideas about Afghanistan and made it home. So Deshe, Bideshe, as you can imagine, is very much a pun. It's not a factual description of what he was doing. Being at home is very much the same as being abroad in this case. So we finally come to Mujtaba Ali. This is Mujtaba Ali at a very, very young age, a very young, handsome, curly-haired man, right? He was in Shantiniketan, as I told you, from 1921 to 1926. He's barely 23 years old when he begins his journey from Howrah station. His only preparation, the very first sentence of Deshe Bideshe, Chandni theke noshi ke shirt. It's a very, very cheap shirt that he buys from the flea market at Chandni. What else does he do for this life-changing journey? He goes and learns a few, poems from Sadi. And he was like, yeah, that's more than enough. I don't need anything else. He gets on a train. And as I said, I think in some ways there's a cosmopolitan atmosphere in Shantiniketan that essentially makes it possible for a boy from Sylhet to make that journey across the entire breadth of India and go somewhere where no one from his family, from his immediate surroundings had ever gone before. This is a picture of many of the professors, many of the very well-known scholars and artists who came to Shantiniketan at Rabindranath's invitation. The woman you see standing is Stella Kramrich, the German art critique. You have Professor Moritz, who was an Austrian-German historian and archaeologist. You have Daniel Chan sitting there. The China Bhavan at Shantiniketan is named after him, right? Again, essentially, almost all of these people have had a hand in the training of Mujtaba Ali. So even though it feels like it is a very provincial story that has been played out, it's actually a very, very international story, a transnational story. In many ways, these are the people who are at the German embassy, the French embassy. These are the people who are involved in archaeological digs. One of these people, Professor Moritz, is one who writes a recommendation for Mujtaba Ali to work with the education department in Afghanistan, which has been newly set up so that he can come and teach young Afghans how to be modern. And it's newly set up by Amanullah Khan, the great reformer whose reform went nowhere. Can you see the two blue stars? As I told you, I'm terrible with, that's the extent of how much work I can do. So essentially, got on a train here, and got off the train there, right, across the breadth of India in 3 days. And it's absolutely beautifully portrayed in Deshe Bideshe as well. The size of the shalwar starts increasing, right? He gets on, he's wearing, I think, 1.5 meter shirt. And then he goes to Delhi and people are wearing 3 meter shirts. And then he goes to Peshawar and people have like 6 meters of a shalwar. And that is how he sort of describes the change of what is happening from Bengal. Everyone is tiny. And what happens in Peshawar, everyone is over 6 feet tall, right? And everyone is very interested in him. Everyone asks, he makes this wonderful sort of comparison. If it's a British man, they ask him, going far? Which is a very polite way. You could answer or you could not answer. And everybody, as it gets near Peshawar, asks him, Kahan jayega, where are you going? And then they ask him very particular details of who is staying with, how is he going to manage the cold weather, is he interested in any of the fruits, does he want to marry any of the women? And all the questions that a border security guard might ask you in the US, he gets asked on the train. That's all I'd say. So, as I said, Deshe Bideshe essentially is a depiction not merely of that journey, the train journey, but also of his stay in Afghanistan. It's first published in 1948, but remember, as I said, he's there from 1927 to 29. The book is a sensation. It's serialized in the Deshe, as I said, and everyone is like, where has this person come from? What is he writing about? We have never read anything like this. And he receives a nursing Das Puraskar, right? And as I said, again, with Jajabor, Syed Mujtaba is a person who essentially founds a new genre of writing in Bengal. This form of bell letters, the very height of it is achieved, I think, by Syed Mujtaba. And the painting that you see there is by a Shantiniketan trained artist called Vinayak Masoba. And he was a converted Christian, which I say because my first book was about conversion, so I find that everywhere, so disregard me. But essentially, Mujtaba gave him a photograph. This is the Khyber Pass. This is an artistic rendition of the Khyber Pass. That station that he might have stopped at, that is a Peshawar station at that point. Remember, when he gets on that bus, one of whose headlights has gone missing. You know, the Sardarji continually coaxes it as if he's coaxing his own wife, as it sort of breaks down at every point. They stay in a caravanserai. This is probably the caravanserai that they stay on while they're going to Jalalabad and then from there on to Kabul. Khyber Pass, where this man is on the bus, very devout Sunni Musliman from a Syed family. He remembers his Pandit from Sylhet. Whenever he's in any danger, he says, Radhigo Brojo Shundari Par Karo. He says, Radhigo Brojo Shundari Par Karo, Radha, please take me across this river. He says that multiple times here. This is his Khyber Pass. This is also the pass where the British essentially lose almost every single soldier in the second Anglo-Afghan war. Remember, apparently only one person returns to the fort at Jalalabad. This is where you might know this, and if I'm saying something wrong, please correct me. Afridi tribesmen hide and shoot their Jazel bullets. The Jazel bullet is very important in literary history. Who gets shot by the Jazel bullet? John Watson, with his migrating wound, shot by a Jazel bullet, probably shot by an Afridi tribesman. So again, all the kind of depictions that you find at the Khyber Pass, very high temperatures, very difficult terrain, very difficult to get through, dangerous. For Mujtaba, it's a matter of, just getting through it. Any and every English travelogue, it's a matter of great fear. Again, this attitude, one of great unknowing but also companionship, and the other of great fear and apprehension, I think sort of separates Indian understanding of what Afghanistan might be, the approach to Afghanistan might be, and the British approaches to it, right? He has absolutely beautiful depictions of the newly reforming Kabul, which is being planted with orchards, modern buildings are coming up. Perhaps he was strolling on a street like this where he first sees the wife of the deposed prince, the Muin Sultan Inayatullah Khan. Essentially, Kabul at that point of time is not a desert, it's not a terrible place, it's not a dangerous place, it's a place of Mughal gardens. It's being laid out with newer and newer roads and orchards. New palaces are being built by Amanullah Khan. Multiple embassies are there at this particular point because remember the great game, tensions between Imperial Russia and India. And therefore, this is a place where almost every single Western power, as well as Turkey, has its embassies. It's perhaps one. What? Yes, but it is a buffer zone. That's a language that is being used by the British. To me, I think it was a cosmopolitan zone. But there's a huge amount of exchange of knowledge, of information. And as a result, it's also a melting point. It's a polyphonic sort of place where multiple languages are being spoken, Pashto, Dari, any and every of the languages that the people in the diplomats are speaking. A lot of the Afghan elite speak French at home because they are trained in Paris. So again, there are many registers of languages of music, of people, of goods, almost all the goods of Russia, all the goods of India, all the goods of Afghanistan come to a meeting place in the bazaar at Peshawar, at Kabul, at Jalalabad. Essentially, it's one of the great crossroads of the South Asian subcontinent. In no way, shape, or form is it that desolate, horrible, dangerous buffer zone that the British might paint it as. I just wanted to sort of, show you this picture because this is a man who is a great failure in Afghan history. This is a man who is sort of, mired in a scandal and does not get the throne. This is Amanullah Khan's older brother. He marries Amanullah Khan's wife's older sister, Kaaba Farzi. She's sitting there. In many ways, Mujtaba Ali's great understanding of all levels of Afghan society, from the royal family straight down to the bazaar gossip, is because he makes friends with this particular family. So again, this is not a family which is at the center of political factioning in Afghanistan, but this is also a family which is very much at the center of that hierarchy of the royal family, right? So again, Mujtaba Ali is very, very clear that there are three levels here. One is Afghan aristocracy, the second is, as I said, everyone else, and the third is a lot of Indians who go there during 1920 during the Hijrat. And I can talk about what the Hijrat is in the Q&A. I'm not going to do it right now. Essentially, what it means is there's a constant flow of information. Kabul in and of itself is very self-contained. Whatever is happening in surrounding areas in the provinces, people in Kabul don't seem to be very interested in it. And this is also something that I think bears up with modern history as well. What happens in Kabul decides the fate of Afghanistan. Everything else is, at least for Western powers who try to do nation building or state building, whatever they might call it, it's not quite as important. And I think that is one of the major reasons why Western efforts at modernization essentially fail in Afghanistan at all different points. And Mujtaba Ali, I think, makes this point very, very clearly in his travelogue. So again, that idea that it's a Romo-Rachana, very lightheartedly written travelogue, doesn't quite hold up. It's much more complex than that. As I said, there are these new modern Western modeled modernization processes which are being started by Amanullah Khan. Here you see him with his wife Soraya Terzi. This is Soraya Terzi's father, Muhammad Terzi, one of the great literateurs of Afghanistan, someone who started a newspaper. Essentially, he is the one who holds the hand of Amanullah in trying to bring about these reforms through a series of nizamnamas or documents, orders, starting in 1923. What are the kinds of reforms that they want? They want everyone to wear Western dress. They want Western models of education. They want women to go without the veil. They want girls to go to school. Again, the pace of reform is very, very fast. I'm talking about weeks and days rather than months and years. And as a result, this creates a huge amount of controversy in an area within families which have very, very strong tribal models of behavior, and which would probably have been more receptive to his ideas had he not been as arrogant and tried to not push through his reforms at such a fast speed. One of the most important and I think funniest to me pictures of this is him asking everyone in the lower jirga to wear Western dress at Teresi. And essentially, other than one gentleman in the very first row who's smiling, I don't see anyone happy about it. Okay. It is exactly at this same point that he undertakes, that is Amanullah Khan also undertakes a journey all across Western Europe. And even the US, this is Soraya Terzi without a veil. In Turkey, as you can see, she is also essentially featured in the Time magazine as one of these great female reformers, just by the dint of the fact that she appears before the general public without a veil. And when they had to wear veils, these are the Terzi sisters, the three sisters, two of whom, remember, are married into the royal family. They take on this French idea of tying a very diaphanous piece of cloth across their face, which obscures nothing, but sort of technologically takes care, right, of the idea of wearing a veil. Right? And this, as you can imagine, and I've seen this in records and the India Office records as well. The British are looking at this as well. They really want this reform to go through, but they're also very worried that this is creating a huge problem in a society where women going without the veil at least to an older generation, seems sort of something that needed to be negotiated about rather than imposed from the top by a family that is seen as far too westernized for Afghanistan's comfort. The major reason for why all of this reform, all of this, new Afghanistan, new Kabul sort of comes to a stumbling halt is because Amanullah Khan sponsors about 200 schoolgirls, you see some of them seated here, to go to Turkey to receive a Western education. He chooses these girls from prominent families from among the tribes without the permission of their parents, and essentially just decides that they will go. And as you can see, they are all wearing skirts about the knee, none of them is wearing a veil. This becomes, I think, the catalyst in many ways for what comes about, which is known as the Afghan Civil War. And it comes with a man called Bacha Sakal, who is the son of a Pishti or a water carrier. He is not from any of the well-known royal families, aristocratic tribes. He is someone who had worked for the British at one point of time, but obviously is very, very charismatic and essentially decides that Amanullah is a kafir, he is an apostate, his dream needs to come to an end. The very first thing that they do is fire upon the British legate, which is the British embassy, which is about 3 kilometers outside the borders of Kabul. And Lorraine Gold, whose husband Basil Gold was one of the officials in the British legate, essentially is writing a letter to her mother. You can see how extraordinarily scared they are because this seems to sort of come out of nowhere. And Francis Humphreys, which is the first minister to the Afghan ruler, the British Consul General, essentially pins this entire failure on the head of Amanullah Khan in all the British reports that you can see, saying that he shouldn't really have pushed forth his reforms at such a terrific speed without listening to any advice. It's all on him. If he loses his battle, it's all on him. No one is going to essentially, support him at all. This is Bacha Sakal, who with about 900 followers essentially takes up a rebellion. He's supported by a wide majority of the tribal leaders, and within a span of about 2 months, Amanullah Khan suddenly finds that his settled throne is completely unsettled. One of the things that Bacha Sakal does, which I don't think is documented anywhere but in Mujtaba Ali and in another writer who was a Hazara man who wrote perhaps the most important history of the house of Amanullah Khan, is a man called Faiz Ahmed Qadir. Essentially, both of them talk about the huge sexual violence that takes place during the Civil War. Mujtaba Ali writes about it only a very little in Deshe, but he writes about it majorly in Shabnam, which is his novel. He also writes about it in some of the shorter stories, his reminiscences of Afghanistan later on. Faiz Muhammad Qadir writes about it in his reminiscences of the war itself. So Faiz Muhammad Qadir and Mujtaba Ali, I think, give us the only on-the-street level understanding, eyewitness accounts of what happens during that particular civil war, other than what we can glean from the records of any of the foreign embassies, including the British Foreign Legacy of British Foreign Legate, which essentially, it's much more about the losses that the British face rather than what is happening to the common people on the floor, on the streets of Afghanistan. As you can essentially see, this is what is happening. The violence against the Hazaras is very, very widespread, and as you might know, the violence against the Hazaras has been very widespread across history, even to the present day again in Afghanistan. Right? And here we have Francis Humphreys standing with his staff at the British legate. We know him because he had a huge fight with Mujtaba Ali. Mujtaba Ali essentially told Francis Humphreys that the British government was essentially not carrying out its duties regarding its Indian citizens, Indian subjects in Afghanistan. They were only taking care of the foreign embassies and their own staff when the legate was being run by Indian money on Indian taxpayers' money, right? Francis Humphreys is someone who goes down in glory in British history if you look at the records, because he essentially undertakes the world's first airlift. All of you might still remember 21 and the huge airlift that the US essentially undertook when the war on terror suddenly came to a crashing halt, right? Whatever happens in 1928-29 is the world's first airlift, which is undertaken by the RAF and supervised by Francis Humphreys, right? And the worry at this point of time is that Russia essentially has given Amanullah Khan and Bacha Sakab, both of them have been given money, so they are both going to essentially fight it out. And therefore, Afghanistan is going to go into the hands of the Russians. There is also worry on the Afghan side that T. Lawrence of Arabia, is somehow roaming the streets of Kabul, sowing dissension. Lots and lots of rumors. The rumors essentially make up a part of Afghan history as well. The only person of South Asian origin that you can see there, right, is a man called Mahbub Ali, who also comes back in a story by Mujtaba Ali. He was a great friend of Mujtaba Ali, actually, called Moni, which is about a Pathan girl who falls in love with Mujtaba Ali and wants to marry her. Somehow all Pathan girls seem to fall in love with Mujtaba Ali and wanted to marry him. I don't know how that happened, but whatever. Essentially, a very large third section of Bideshe is taken up, but what happens was Bacha Sakab's army starts getting ascendancy in Kabul. As I told you, there is huge amounts of sexual violence against women. There is no food available. There is a looting of the Ark, the palace. Essentially, because of his fight with Francis Humphreys, his name is crossed out, that is Mujtaba Ali's name is crossed out from the world's first airlift. So he's left by the British government in Kabul in extremely dire circumstances, whereas almost 500 other people are airlifted out of Kabul by the RAF. I'll give you a minute to read. The thing that Mujtaba Ali is upset about is everyone is given precedence by the British government in terms of this airlift, other than the Indians who had gone there at the invitation of the Afghan government to take part in the reforms, to teach at their institutions. Somehow these are the people who did not merit any consideration by the British, even though the entire legate, the airlift, was all being run on Indian money. This is all documented very, very clearly in a book called Wings Over Kabul, which was written by the daughter of one of the men involved in this. These are the kinds of aeroplanes that were being used. Almost everybody was allowed to carry only about 20 pounds of luggage. Mujtaba Ali was told he could carry only 7 pounds. So how much is 7 pounds? How many kilograms? How much can you carry? He could not carry any of his possessions from Afghanistan. He could not carry any of the money that he had earned. He returned almost destitute. He was finally allowed a place on the last aeroplane to come out of Kabul on 25th February 1928 because his brother, a civil services officer, asked the British government and wrote a very strong letter, and he was given a place at the very last moment on the seat to get out of Kabul. If you look at some of the British India Office records, you can again find the kind of people who were being airlifted. As you can see, Indians really don't find any place, Indian subjects don't really find any place there. You don't have to strain your eyes, I can give you the list here. British subjects, as in British officers and their wives and children. Afghans, as in Afghans belonging to the royal family, French, Germans, Italians, Persians, Romanians, Swiss, Syrians and Turks. All of these are people from the other embassies. This should also give you a sense of how deeply cosmopolitan Kabul used to be with this many embassies. United States citizen one, this was a journalist who sort of entered and Kabul and wrote a number of articles for the Chicago Tribune. that you can still find. None of these merit any kind of, none of these are Indians. And when the question is asked, it's said, well, Indians just wanted to stay back. In a situation of civil war, they really did not want to leave. So there is a difference between what you find in the archives and what you find in eyewitness reports. And I think this is one of the signal sort of education lessons that you can find from Mujtaba, which is that the story that is told by eyewitness accounts, memorial reconstruction, very different from British archival records. So learn to read between the lines, right? I just want to come to an end. I've already spoken for about 30 minutes now, so I just want to sort of wrap this up a little bit. There are two moments in Deshe, which I think, even in the way in which Mujtaba writes about them, create a huge emotional effect on him, and the way in which he writes it creates a huge emotional effect on the reader themselves. One of them is a wedding that he attends right before the Civil War breaks out. It's at the house of a minister called Saifullah, who is educated in France, who only speaks French with Mujtaba, essentially, but the marriage ceremony is very, very traditional. This is the marriage ceremony where, Mujtaba has this amazing sentence. It's like, how do you become a minister? How do you become a minister? And you learn how to sit among boards without being bored, right? So anyway, Mujtaba has this wonderful description of being in an inner room with the closest friends of Saifullah, where Afghan dervish, who might have looked something like this, starts singing a song. What is the song? The song is, well, perhaps on this evening, if my beloved gives me one kiss, I'm going to live my life, my very difficult life, all over again, right? This is how it is. And Mujtaba sort of describes the experience of listening to this song as a synesthetic experience. The sound enters his mind as colors. It's as if he's watching a sunset happening over the hills surrounding Kabul. As he comes out of that trance, the song begins at midnight. When he comes out of this trance, it's already morning. He says, well, this is perhaps the soul of Afghanistan, that there is so much difficulty, but Afghans love their country as if they would love their beloved. And that is why one small moment of joy can make them undertake almost all of the suffering that comes with it, right? The second experience comes at the very end, after he's suffered through, not being given an airlift. There has been almost 2 weeks in which there has been complete chaos on the streets of Kabul, no food is available. He's very weak because nothing but bread, stale bread is available, right? He somehow decides to walk to the grave of Babur. And the grave of Babur is in the Mughal gardens, as you can see, this is the grave. And he has this absolutely astonishing sort of, part of writing about the connection between Kabul, between Afghanistan and about India. Remember how I said that the idea of Hindustan itself emerges out of Kabul. It is where the Mughals essentially start thinking about creating an empire which they will make the greatest on earth, which they would call Hindustan, right? And he has this absolutely beautiful piece of writing there. He's talking about what it means to look out from Kabul towards India. Kabul is on hilly terrain. The grave is on a hill. Stand up at the grave of Babur, and you look eastwards. You are looking straight at Hindustan, right? And Babur decided that he was going to be buried there. If you look at the grave, this is not one of the great mausoleums that any of his successors built in India. This is very plain and simple. He says this is the great guardian of the idea of Hindustan itself. He's keeping in watch, right? And he talks here about going down in a prayer, in a sajda. And he says something very, very interesting. His language in general is very polished. It's very well regulated. He uses the word Dhorshito here, Ingraj Dhorshito Bharatvarsha. Remember that there has been huge sexual violence happening in Kabul at this point. Remember that one of his friend's wives perhaps is a target of it. We get hints of it. Remember that he's writing the story between 1946 and 48 when what is happening in India? Communal violence, violence against women. All of that is in his mind. In a way, the violence that happens against India, Ingrajit Hoshika Bharatvarsha, is perhaps the harshest censure, the violation, not merely violence, but violation of the soul of India. He sits there at the grave of the first emperor of India, the person who originates the idea of India as a unified entity, as Hindustan, and says, may that India that I can look at sitting here from the grave of the man who's been keeping an eye out on all of his creation, may that India receive mukti, moksha, najat, 3 different words which mean the same thing in 3 different languages. Liberation, enlightenment, najat, kind of, freedom from the cycle of sin and suffering that we all have, right? It is that moment when he is thinking about his mother in Sylhet, offering the morning prayer, where he has not eaten anything, he does not know if he will make his way out of Kabul, where again, remember how Rabindranath had collapsed the boundaries between home and foreign lands? He collapses those boundaries. His mother offering a prayer in Sylhet on the very farthest reach of the empire. It's the same as Babur keeping a watch on the empire sitting in Kabul. We all know that he came out of there. He had a fairly successful sort of career until 1947, after which everything went to pieces. And I just want to talk a little bit about why it went to pieces. This is Mujtaba Ali's passport. The places that he's traveled are all written there. It's cancelled. Why? This is the passport that's finally cancelled when India receives independence. So as a British subject, the kind of mobility that you could have across South Asia, across the Bay of Bengal, across the Indian Ocean world, with the coming of freedom, with the drawing of national borders, with the creation of new passport regimes, with the kind of suspicion that neighbors start having about each other after the trauma of partition, the kind of mobility that would have made a Deshe possible, or any of his travelogues possible, that possibility, that moment of possibility is completely taken away. So on one hand, paradoxically, South Asians have their much, wanted freedom. On the other hand, the movement, the possibilities of those movements are taken away, right? So Deshe is a story of imperial mobility, but it's also a story of how that mobility comes to a complete end. And mobility not merely physically, but also of the imagination of being able to envision the foreign as one's own. Yeah. And as I said, this is a man who after 1947 constantly moves across the borders of eastern Pakistan and India. This is the man who talks about Purbo Pakistani Rashtra Bhasha. This is the originating moment of the Bhasha movement in eastern Pakistan, as a result of which he has to flee back again into India. This is the man whose job in Shantiniketan is taken away because everyone around him says that he is a spy for Pakistan. This is a man who dies in complete penury, in very, very poor health, and he has to be taken back to Dhaka in 1974 to die a very painful death. Again, this is a kind of experience that I might say a lot of Indians have. They suddenly find that their homeland itself has become a foreign land. Wherever it is that they call it home, they have to leave that home and go to another place, which again is not a home any longer. So Deshe essentially is a reflection of people who are homeless. It is a reflection of someone who belongs nowhere and wants to belong at some place which would give him some security. Thank you, everyone. Difficult questions. Do you want me to do the Q&A at the mic as well?
Yeah, you can stand.
Okay.
The floor is open.
You told us to remind you if you forgot about the film, and I was really interested in it. Also, another question, I understand, in my understanding of ethnography, it's basically a slice of time on paper. So it's a very depressed, very consolidated version of definition that I'm giving. So can we kind of understand all these travelogues or this style of writing as a sort of ethnographic writing in which he tries to record the kind of surrounding that he's on to form a sort of archival understanding. Maybe it's like you were again talking about the archive and
Beautiful question.
Talks about the archive and how the reality actually differs, like you have to read between the lines. But again, he is here giving us an ethnographic understanding of how Kabul was through his eyes in that slice of time that we are restricting.
Beautiful questions, thank you. First question, the flaneur, of course I forgot about it. If you read Deshe, Bideshe, it's a constant story of Mujtaba Ali walking the streets of Kabul, taking a journey to one Mughal garden or the other, going to a friend's house and essentially just going in and making, a demand of whatever it is that he wants to eat. It's a constant sort of, diary of people, conversations, streets, rumors. And he's getting his information from a wide variety of people. He's getting it from the Muin Sultan, Inayatullah Khan and his wife. He's getting it from his servant Abdul Rahman, who's going to the bazaar and bringing him all the news that is happening on the surface level. And he's constantly sort of tallying those two pieces of information and trying to figure out where the political air of Kabul is blowing next, right? So in a way, it's very much the work of a political commentator as well. Deshe Bideshe essentially is about him trying to figure out what is going to happen tomorrow and where his own space might be. And that comes from a place of insecurity, I think, because he likes being there. He's also a little homesick, but he's earning a lot, and somehow to him, from the very beginning, it's very clear that it's a very unstable political situation, and he's trying to sort of triangulate that. That is only possible if he actually takes those walks. Remember that he meets Kabul while he's taking a walk on one of those roads near an orchard, all by himself, and Kabul is like, why is this young man so sad? Let me ask my husband to play tennis with him. Apparently these things happened in Kabul at that point of time, I don't know. Right? But the constant triangulation of information, royal family, his colleagues at the education department, his friends on the streets, the employees at the legate, remember Mahabubali who I talked about. His own facility with languages certainly helped. He spoke English, French, Dari, Pashto, Farsi, and a handful of others, I think 17 languages in all. Essentially having that facility with languages certainly helped. But you see him constantly walking, constantly listening and asking for information, constantly mapping Kabul in ways that are very, very interesting. So this is very much, the component of the Attabaj, the one who constantly talks to people about inconsequential things. He's talking to them about inconsequential things. He might be talking about the flowers in the garden, but he's also listening out for other kinds of information that happens when you have an aimless conversation. At the same time, he's constantly walking and mapping on space. And I think that is why I said he sort of marries this idea of the Attabaj and the flaneur with such great facility. That's one. The second is about ethnography, right? And if you look at British systems or Western systems of ethnography, travel is domination. You go to a place, you essentially sort of think of it as exotic, you sort of, write down things about how strange and different they are, and then you come back home and then you put it into some, imperial gazetteers, and that's about it. Afghans are dangerous and lawless. Afghanistan is a terrible person, right? Mujtaba Ali is doing something very, very different. Instead of differences, he's looking for similarities. So yes, it is ethnography of a sort as well, but the linkages that he's trying to revive are very much historical, cultural, and linguistic. Again, as I said, it takes a particular kind of person to have that sort of facility with languages, but it also takes a very particular kind of person educated at Vishwabharati to know the wider ramifications of the historical context of what it is that makes Afghanistan so central to Indian history, even at a moment of colonial subjugation. Also remember, Afghanistan is where the colonial British project fits. They really can't do anything about it. So for many Indians, including Rabindranath, including his student Mujtaba Ali, the Afghan is a great exemplar of what can happen when conditions of colonialism do not exist. Right? The kind of politics that can happen, and that is why the Civil War is such a great grief to Mujtaba Ali, that moment of existence without colonial models, when that is taken away to him, that is a great loss even to Indians as well. Does that answer your question?
My question is rather about identity. You talked about Afghanistan being a cosmopolitan world where there is.
I talked about Kabul being a cosmopolitan world. Yes.
So where there are various levels of interaction, and in one hand we see that for the British, the entire Afghanistan was always where the threat of Russia can start from. So, and Mujtaba talked about had interaction on the ground level. So, did he classify or any
তুমি বাংলাতেই বলো, কোনো অসুবিধা নেই, বলো।
এবার আফগানিস্তান লোকেদের জন্য, তাদের জন্য তারা নিজেদের কি একটা কসমোপলিটন ওয়ার্ল্ডে কিভাবে দেখছে, তারা মানে কোথায় দাঁড়িয়ে আছে, যে এখানে কাবুল পেশোয়ারে রেলওয়ে নেটওয়ার্ক কানেকশন আছে, একটা গ্লোবাল ওয়ার্ল্ড আস্তে আস্তে তৈরি হচ্ছে, মানে বিভিন্ন জায়গার লোক ওখানে বাজারে আসছে। তো এবার আফগানিস্তানের লোকের তারা কোথায় বিলং, তো এই আইডেন্টি, ওদের আইডেন্টিটিটা তাদের
ভীষণ ভালো প্রশ্ন করেছো। ওকে, ইজ ইট ওকে ইফ আই আনসার ইন ইংলিশ? Right, this is an important question, and this is also a question that Mujtaba Ali himself grapples with, right? British think of Afghans in a particular way. Indians obviously think of Afghans in a particular way as well, and Mujtaba Ali himself is not free of that particular idea, right? Where he thinks of them as very masculine, very politically involved, very, very committed to freedom without British interference, very, very fearless in every single way, right? What do Afghans think of themselves? And this comes back as a joke multiple times. If you have crossed the Attock, you're no longer a true Afghan. If you've crossed from Peshawar into Jalalabad, are you still a true Afghan? Have you gone to Kabul? Then maybe you are a true Afghan, right? What is it that you do? Do you count your bullets before you go out on your night patrols and you know how many people you have to shoot? In that case, you know you are a true Afghan. If you just essentially shoot at anybody, you cannot be a true Afghan because you don't know the value of bullets. What ultimately comes out beyond the jokes is there is a very clear stratification that he himself sees in Afghan society. The first is the very top aristocratic layer, which is in many ways because of its own international reach, because of the fact that many of these people are educated in the Western world, as I said, in France and in England, and very much also in secular Turkey. They have a particular idea about openness to the world that most of the other people do not. Kabul in and of itself has such a cosmopolitan atmosphere that people there probably think of themselves as far more in touch with the nerve of whatever is happening in the world outside Kabul. But then at every single moment when Amanullah's plan starts failing, first in 1923, after the Khost rebellion, as a result of which his reforms have to come to a grinding halt, then after 1927 and in 1928, it becomes very clear that what the Kabul aristocracy thinks of its own, prominence and its own ideas about what should happen in Afghanistan is certainly not the kind of idea that is prevalent in the provinces outside of Kabul. So again, there is a tribal Afghanistan, which is perhaps as far from the mental imagination of the Afghan aristocracy, at least the Afghan aristocracy under Amanullah Khan. And the tribal world itself has its own very clear sets of rules under which it operates. And it is very proud of that particular identity, and it thinks of this imposing of reform on a Western model by this completely clueless royals from Kabul as a great imposition. So again, there is no one monolithic Afghan people. There are particular layers of Afghan people who all think about their own identity in very particular ways. Where do women come here? Certainly, Mujtaba Ali seems to think that even if Afghan women mostly stay within the home or use the parda, they are the ones who are taking the decisions. Sarwar Ulia Jahan, that is Amanullah's mother, most certainly is the one who is the mover and shaker. Even in the British, India Office records, you find that she essentially she hates Amanullah after he loses his throne. It's like she is like, I had to kill my husband and my brother-in-law to give you the throne, and this is what you've done to it in 10 years. What have you done, right? In Shabnam again, as I said, Pathan women seem to like this 5'3" tall Bengali man. I don't know why. But again, it's the women who are the initiators of romantic relationships, not men, right? So you have to, I think, also remember that Mujtaba Ali himself has his own set of biases, his own understanding of political circumstances within which he is writing over, experiencing it at one point of time, writing about it 20 years later. And then to triangulate all three kind of points in order to come to an understanding about what it is that Deshe is doing and what it might mean for politics of the South Asian subcontinent at that particular moment. Okay? Arjun.
আমার যে প্রশ্নটা আছে সেটা হচ্ছে যে বেঙ্গলি ট্রাভেলগ যেগুলো রয়েছে আফগানিস্তানের বা এই যে আপনি শুরুতেই যেটা উল্লেখ করছেন যে কাবুলিওয়ালার প্রসঙ্গটি, এবং সেখানে মানে রবীন্দ্রনাথের লেখার মধ্যে রয়েছে আফগানদের সম্পর্কে বাঙালিদের একটা মানে তাদেরকে একটা শ্রদ্ধার চোখে দেখা বা মানে যেহেতু তারা ব্রিটিশদের এগেনস্টে লড়াই করেছে এরকম একটা ধারণা ছিল তাদের মধ্যে। তো কোথাও কি মানে এখানে কেবলমাত্র পশতুন যারা পশতুন এবং আফগান এইটার মধ্যে কি একটা জেনারেলাইজেশন হতে যেহেতু ডেভেলপমেন্টের প্রশ্নটা হলো যে মানে যে আফগান আইডেন্টিটি কোনটা আসলে ট্রু আফগান আইডেন্টিটি কোনটা আসছে। তো কাবুলিওয়ালা মূলত তারা যারা আর কি মানে আফগান মানে তারা বিভিন্ন ইন্ডিয়ান সিটিগুলোতে তারা আসছে। আবার অথচ যখন পরবর্তীকালে মহাপ্রসাদ মুখোপাধ্যায় আফ্রিকাগুলোকে লিখছেন
পেশাওয়ার নিয়ে লিখে শেষ করে দিচ্ছে না, পেশাওয়ার অব্দি গিয়ে শেষ করে দিচ্ছে
এবং মূলত যে পশতুন এলাকা সেখানে তিনি ট্রাভেল করছেন, কিন্তু সে থেকে কাবুল যাচ্ছে তারা সাথে প্রপার আফগানিস্তান যাচ্ছেন না। তো এখানে বাঙালি ইমাজিনেশনের মধ্যে কি এই একটা মানে জেনারেলাইজ হয়ে যাচ্ছে যেটা মুসলমান দেখা যাচ্ছে না, বা উনি খুব ডিটেলসে কথাগুলো বলেছেন।
Ramnath Bisha's লেখায় the travelogues of Ramnath Bisha's, the man who circumnavigated the world on a bicycle, he actually does go to Kabul. And there he writes mostly about the Indians who had undertaken the Hijrat in 1920 and their position in that Indian, within that particular kind of political circumstance in Afghanistan. I'm not going to generalize and say that there is a conflation of the ideas of a Pashtun and an Afghan. I think that might be true for Prasad Mukhopadhyay, who is very deeply concerned about the Kali temple in Peshawar for whatever reason, and does not think of writing about anything else. But knowing his family, I completely understand why the Kali temple would be his focal point of understanding of Peshawar. But every other writer, up to, and I'm just going to go back to that slide. Give me 2 minutes to go back 34 slides. 1 minute, 30 seconds, whatever. Even Kabuliwala Bangali Bo, right, or Kabuler Pothe Pothe Panthojon. Kabuliwala Bangali Bo is a Bengali woman who goes into the deep interior of Afghanistan and lives for a while there. Comes back to Kolkata, goes back again and is killed by the Taliban. Kabuler Pothe Pothe Panthojon is obviously someone who is an Indian bureaucrat who is, in Afghanistan to work on Indian projects of infrastructure building. None of them, I think, actually conflate that meaning other than Murshid himself. So I'm not particularly sure that this is a distinction that actually stands. Again, to make that distinction, are the Taliban not a part of Afghanistan? Then we are going into really, really difficult territory. I think that's particular to Umar Prasad, at least in my opinion. I do not think most of the other travelogue writers, Bengali travelogue writers, actually conflate that meaning. Okay?
I have a question. I use the microphone.
Well,
So I was thinking you mentioned how we might see this. historical document. So my question is, since my question is that ever since the publishing of this book and then its serialization, we know about its reception in popular and somewhat in intellectual circles, but I was wondering, I want to get a sense of how this text has been, how have historians and historically inclined scholars of literature engaged with this text, whether that be in English or in vernacular.
As I said, there is a huge problem here. Anybody after 1947 is somehow not of the same stature as Rabindranath and then, Mou Banerjee group and the Kolkata group, so on and so forth. So obviously their literary works are not worth of historical examination. I know of one essay, I can't unfortunately remember the writers, where they talk about the literary aesthetics of Deshe Bideshe. It's an interesting paper, but not much to do with the history of it. There's one article written by Shupriya Chaudhary, but it's very much about the cosmopolitan networks of Mujtaba, and Deshe Bideshe is a very small part of it. There is one rather terrible article written by Syed Mujtaba. I'm friends with Chris, but unfortunately his Bangla is terrible. So that's not a good article. RK, who else has written about it? Where are the translations? I was just having a talk with your professor about this as well. This is such a well-read, widely traveled man. His travelogues need to be translated. Only Jolidama and Deshe Bideshe have been translated, that too in the past 5 years. And by someone in Bangladesh, Nazis Afroz, who was the chair of the BBC, the South Asia, part of it. Again, I don't think that's a wonderful translation. Mujtaba's language is on so many different registers, and as I said, it's almost polyphonic, so many different languages used there as well. It's very difficult to do a really good translation. At least there's a translation. Let's just give him that. Right? Naim Mohammed, the Bangladeshi filmmaker, who is also, I think, a grand-nephew of Mujtaba Ali, has translated some of his short stories. But where is the wider acceptability? If I say Mujtaba Ali today, people will have or may not have read Deshe Bideshe. Some might have read that one small essay on, which is a part of Deshe Bideshe actually, which is about a night stay in one of the Mughal gardens. But this terrible story of a prisoner, Makuchi Muslim, right? They just take because one prisoner sort of flees, they take an innocent man from the roadways and just make him a part of, because they have to keep the numbers of prisoners intact, and then 25 years later, that man is asked what is his identity, and he says, well, I'm number 45, right? That too is people might have read that much. How many people read Mujtaba Ali these days? You are at Presidency, you might have read it, but you are the cream of the cream. You do not represent Bengalis as a whole, just as Behala probably does not represent Kolkata, as I have been told. You do not represent all of Bengalis. So again, Mujtaba Ali himself is a forgotten person in many ways. His very, very difficult post-colonial journeys essentially also mean that he's been relegated to someone who's mildly amusing about Afghanistan, but then you get into the actual text and the language itself is a barrier for many people. It's very difficult language, right? Kaji, I would love it if 10 people had written about it before me. It makes my work much easier, 10 citations and I'm done with this. Right? But maybe some of you will take this up and write about it. No? Anyone else? একটু জোরে বলবো, I can't hear the serious one.
তো বসেই বলছি।
হ্যাঁ, ঠিক আছে, বল।
তো আপনি বলছিলেন যে কাবুল যাওয়ার পথে খাইবার ক্রস করার সময় ব্রিটিশদের মনোভাব, there was great fear among যেখানে সৈয়দ মুজতবা আলীর ক্ষেত্রে it was a moment of excitement. আমি যেটুকু পড়েছি সেখান থেকে আমার মনে আছে যখন উনি বাসে চড়েছেন, উনি বলছেন হাওড়ায় খুব একা লেগেছিল, এখন ভয়ঙ্কর একা লাগছে, এবং তারপরেই কিছুটা ভায়োলেন্সের বর্ণনা।
কি ভায়োলেন্সের বর্ণনা একটু বলো তো, মনে করি আমার তো মনে পড়ছে।
আফ্রিদিদের কথা কিছুটা আছে এবং তার সাথে
আফ্রিদিদের কথা আছে, তারা বেডশিট চুরি করে নিয়ে যেতে পারে আর মাঝে মাঝে বন্ধুকে গুলি
এক্স্যাক্টলি, এবং
সেটা পেশাওয়ার নিয়েও গল্প আছে।
সেখানে কমপ্লিট ললেসনেস সেটাও বলা আছে। তো কোথাও গিয়ে, এটা হয়তো আমার নিজের পড়া, কোথাও গিয়ে ইমপ্লিসিটলি হয়তো ওনার মনেও একটা ভয় ছিল, বাট যেটা আমার মনে হয় খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং, সেই ভয়টার সাথে উনি কীভাবে কপআপ করছেন, হাউ ইজ ট্যাকলিং দ্যাট, এবং সেটা হয়তো কোথাও গিয়ে নিউ ডাইনামিক্স অফ হাউ ইউ আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড দ্য সেলফ অ্যান্ড দ্য আদার। সেইটা মানে ইটস নট কমপ্লিটলি ফিয়ারলেস, খুব এক্সাইটেড অ্যাবাউট ইট, বাট হয়তো ওনার কাছে কম্পারেটিভ ওয়াজ মোর ইম্পর্টেন্ট, কারণ হি ইজ নেভিগেটিং this whole problem in a different light, constructing a new dynamics of self and other, and so on and so forth. এটা একটা, এটা আমার একটা পয়েন্ট ছিল। এবং আরেকটা যেটা আপনি বললেন যে কিভাবে এটাকে আমরা পলিটিক্যাল কমেন্ট্রি হিসেবে করতে পারি, আফগানিস্তানের যে ঘটনাগুলো ঘটছে 1927, 1929 সিরিজ, কোথাও গিয়ে আমরা এটাকে 1940s এর পরে, স্পেশালি যেহেতু এই সময় পার্টিশন হচ্ছে, সে তার পরিপ্রেক্ষিত করতে পারি। তার একটা বড় কারণ হচ্ছে দেশে বিদেশেতে উনি বারবার কিন্তু পূর্ব বাংলা শব্দটা ব্যবহার করেছেন, পূর্ব পাকিস্তান নয়, এবং সিরিয়ালাইজ হচ্ছে 1948-এ। পূর্ব বাংলা বহুবার ব্যবহৃত, এবং আপনি নিজেও দেখালেন যে উনি পূর্ব বাংলার রাষ্ট্রভাষা এই শব্দটা ব্যবহার করছেন, এবং পরে থেকে আপনি যখন বলছেন ইংরাজ ঘোষিত ভারতবর্ষ, সেইখানে একটা বিষয় যেটা আমার মনে হলো, আমি যদি অন্বেষা রায় কাজ আমার মনে পড়ছিল, অন্বেষা রায় বলছিল 1941-এর পরে আমরা সেক্সুয়াল ভায়োলেন্স দেখছি, স্পেশালি রায়টস এক্সেট্রাতে। সেই জায়গা থেকে কতটা ওনার যে ভাষার ব্যবহার এবং কিছু কিছু এই যে উপমাগুলো ব্যবহার করা, এগুলো অ্যাকচুয়ালি ভারতবর্ষে 1940s-এর পরে যে ঘটনাগুলো, সেইগুলোর একটা পলিটিক্যাল কমেন্ট্রি হিসেবে আমরা করতে পারি।
Very good questions, thank you. The first one, of course, is I would counter your understanding of that particular, আমার নিজের মনে হচ্ছে মজা করে বলছেন। When he comes to Peshawar, one of the first things he notices is the nails strewn all about in the streets, right? Which could be taken as an idea of lawlessness as well. You really don't let, if you have any civic sense, your roads should not be littered with nails that people's shoes get caught on, people's horses' hooves get caught on, right? It's a way of making people slow down, not go to Satan. He uses a particular term there, and essentially enjoy a particular kind of community. He also talks about people going out on night patrols in a policeman, because he's staying with the policeman, and then essentially knowing at what moment you need to sort of lie down flat on your back in a train, because you don't quite know where the bullets are going to come from. And the third thing that he mentions, of course, is someone who's about 5 feet tall fighting it out and then being crowned the great mafia leader of all gangs in Peshawar. The same thing, same stories. The first story is about the Afridis and their Giselle bullets. The second story is about how the Afridis essentially stole a bed sheet from under the Afghan king on a day, right? There's serious understanding of the violence, which is a rumor. There's also a kind of immediate sort of use of humor to sort of bring down the level of that violence. It did not seem to me in my own reading that he was actually afraid. Bhayankar eka lagche, but in the next 5 minutes he makes friends with someone who works at Radio Kabul, who starts speaking to him about now we are entering Jalalabad, but in perfect French, right? He makes friends with the Sikh man who is the driver of that particular vehicle, which breaks down at every particular moment. He makes friends with people all across his journey during that train, makes people with the passport officer when they stop at Jalalabad Fort. He is very good at making friends. And I think that particular way of using the intimacy of friendship is to take away from the normal narrative that you find of a very dangerous Khyber Pass. The one thing that he says about the Khyber Pass is temperatures reach 48 degrees Celsius. It's very hot. The physical discomfort of a journey like this, even in the sarai, the smells, the animals and human beings gathered together, it's talking about discomfort a lot. He might be talking about loneliness, which he immediately offsets with friendships. I do not see that he's talking about violence or intimacies of violence. The one place where he does talk about being afraid is when the civil war actually breaks out and he has not been given a space on the flight to get out of Kabul. it seems as if his future is completely bleak because he does not believe in the kind of politics of a man like Mujtaba. That's one thing. Second was a question about Munira. What was your second question? The sexual violence, right? Yes, so I would probably agree with Anushka here, and I would agree with you as well. And I think I said that too in my lecture, that a part of why he is constantly thinking about that sexual violence is because he himself is seeing what is happening in the South Asian subcontinent. By the way, Purbo Bangla Rashtra Bhasha is first given as a lecture in 1947, in 30th November, where he calls it Purbo Pakistan Rashtra Bhasha. He is then told that the Pakistan army is going to be after him, and he immediately flees straight back into India. Purbo Bangla Rashtra Bhasha is the form in which the lecture is published. So again, the politics of what you call it is very, very important there, if I'm not remembering wrong, right? But at the same time, we have Faiz Muhammad Khatib Hazara's own eyewitness accounts of what is happening during that particular moment in the civil war in Afghanistan, where he is very, very clear that sexual violence is taking place, horrible sexual violence is taking place against the women by Mujtaba and his armies. Mujtaba writes about this again when Shabnam is published in 1960. So obviously it's not merely a projection of the sexual violence happening in India, but it's, in a way I think the memories of Afghanistan, of what he underwent and what he saw, are sort of brought up, the trauma is brought up all over again when the violence starts in India right before partition. So I don't think that there is, shook behind it. Did it not happen in Afghanistan? He's just projecting. I don't think that's true. But I think one trauma informs the other. Memory again, memorial reconstruction. If I think about it here now, if you give me a rasgulla, I'm going to probably think about the first rasgulla I ate as a 3-year-old. That does not mean that rasgulla at my age 3 did not exist. I'm just projecting that rasgulla back into the past. Right? That's a very, very sort of, humorous, simplistic sort of trying to say this. But I think in many ways the trauma that he undergoes between 1946 and 48 informs the way in which he reconstructs his memories of Afghanistan. Oh, absolutely, there's parallels there, and those parallels come out very, very clearly. And the very fact that he uses the word torshita or rape, violation and sexual violation very much is a reflection of what is happening in India as a result of abnegation by the British of any kind of political duties. Right? That's very much true. The mom should take. Vote of thanks. Oh.
Although I would really like to thank everybody who came here today despite the torrential rainfall. It's time for the vote of thanks. It is with great honor that we extend our immense gratitude on behalf of Voyages into the Past to Professor Mou Banerjee for sharing with us such an insightful lecture. We at Voyages would like to present a small token of our appreciation to you, and a member of Voyages, Shruti, will be presenting it. We want to extend our thanks to the University Administration.
Thank you, everybody. It was an absolute pleasure. Your questions are amazing. Made me think about my own biases a lot. So thank you. And thank you for coming in the rain. Thank you very much.
We want to extend our thanks to the University Administration for their consistent support in providing us with a platform for such talks and discussions, and the Development Office for the technical support. Thanks to the Voyages team for helping in making this event a success. We would also like to extend our gratitude to the faculty and academics who have encouraged and supported us in many ways and helped us come as far as we have. We would also like to bring your notice to the fact that Voyages into the Past is now accepting donations